top stories of the hour, but we start with the top story. And Venezuela and US forces have captured the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, marking a dramatic escalation in American involvement in the Western Hemisphere. US President Donald Trump has framed this action under what he calls the Don-Roe Doctrine, which is a rebranding of the historic Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was articulated by the 5th US President, James Monroe, in 1823. The doctrine warned European powers against the colonization or puppet regimes in the Western Hemisphere. It established the region as separate from Europe, influencing US actions in countries from Mexico to Cuba and across Central America for over 2 centuries. Its core principles of non-colonization and non-intervention were later invoked to justify US influence across Latin America, including in Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Meanwhile, Trump's new Don-Roe Doctrine asserts a more aggressive stance, emphasizing American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Unlike the original Monroe Doctrine, it openly prioritizes US control and influence, framing interventions as necessary to protect American interests. Let's in fact listen in to what Trump had to say.
Furthermore, under the now deposed dictator Maduro, Venezuela was increasingly hosting foreign adversaries in our region and acquiring menacing offensive weapons that could threaten U.S. interests and lives. And they used those weapons last night. Potentially in league with the cartels operating along our border. All of these actions were in gross violation of the core principles of American foreign policy, dating back more than 2 centuries. And not anymore. All the way back, it dated to the Monroe Doctrines. And the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Don-Roe Doctrine. I don't know. It's Monroe Doctrine. We sort of forgot about it. It was very important, but we forgot about it. We don't forget about it anymore.
Joining us now in this discussion is Ben Aris, a former Moscow bureau head of The Telegraph. He joined us live from Berlin, and also joining us is Mark Sutherland, a geopolitical commentator, joining us live from London. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on NewsX World. It's always a pleasure to speak to you both. Of course, shocking news coming yesterday. The president of Venezuela toppled, but also kidnapped and taken to the United States to face the full front of American justice in New York. However, your thoughts on Donald Trump's statements there, the so-called Don-Roe Doctrine. Is this the Monroe Doctrine reborn or something far more dangerous? Ben Aris, I'm going to come to you first. Ben, I believe you're on mute. Apologies. Okay, apologies. We seem to be having some audio issues there. Hopefully we get Ben back very soon. Okay, ongoing. This is an ongoing situation, of course. President Nicolas Maduro and his wife have been kidnapped. Of course, Donald Trump citing American interests and the protection of America within this operation. Hopefully we are going to be joined now by Ben Aris. Ben, I pose the same question to you. The Monroe Doctrine once implied the hands off America. Is this something far more dangerous here?
Can you hear me?
Okay, we have some network issues there with Ben. Hopefully we're getting back very soon. But Mark, I'm going to ask you the same thing. Does this effectively declare Latin America a US protectorate once again? Of course, following this, we've seen condemnations from across the continent. What are your thoughts on this?
Thomas, good to be with you. I think Ben is able to join you very shortly as he sorted out his sound. Again, as I so often say to you, that we have to go back in history. The Monroe whole process is rather fascinating, and a statement that Monroe then made in 2023. But it's then going back, of course, to our War of Independence with them in 1776, and then looking at the battle in 1812, which was about trade, but Monroe stating no more colonial involvement in regard to America. We can then go through the history of when you're establishing embassies. There were American diplomats in many, many South American countries. Also, we have to acknowledge we're not going to move away from regime change in Guatemala in 1954, etc. We've got to acknowledge that. But the number one thing is we are looking at, one is narco-terrorism, as Rachel Ehrenfeld wrote a very good book about that. But we also, according to the Americans, and I agree, we then have to look at Hamas, Hezbollah, other elements that they are not happy in regard to their what's happening in their backyard, Thomas, and also China involvement. Remember, China, it looks like within the reports, China had a delegation over there, and then within that going on, they then take Maduro out. We have to look at communism, socialism, and before anyone says Ollie North and Reagan, yes, we accept that. And having spent time in South America myself, we look at all of that history, but it's about hegemony. It's not just about drugs. It's about China and all those other actors behind the lines there that America is not happy with. And just finally, Thomas, look at the fact that there are, I believe, up to 8 million Venezuelans that do not live in Venezuela. We remember at one point, oil industry, and it was a flourishing country. Thomas.
Yes, Mark, thank you. Hopefully Ben is joining us now. Of course, as Mark has just said, Venezuela has both ties with Russia, China, Monroe Doctrine historically to keep colonial powers outside of Latin America and the Americas in a broader terms. Nowadays, it's Russia and China. What do they do now? Of course, they're traditional allies of Venezuela. How do you think they respond? And if any other country did this, let's give those two same examples. Do you think the United States would accept it?
I don't think I'd be exaggerating too much if I describe this as a clash of civilizations, that we have the old world order, the developed world, basically Europe and the States. And we have the new world order, the emerging markets, the global south, however you want to describe them, which are being led by, primarily by China, with Russia in tow, but also the BRICS organization, which also includes Brazil and India and South Africa. And these new countries are rising very fast. Typically, for centuries, they've been much poorer, but now incomes are starting to catch up very fast. And in Russia's case, already the adjusted incomes are on a par with those of the EU. And this has created a huge problem because they don't subscribe to sort of Western liberal values, the Helsinki process, all of those ideas, the EU project. They have their own ideas about how they should organize society. In Russia, China is still, out and out communist. And in Russia, it's like the Moscow consensus as opposed to the Washington consensus, where the state plays a much bigger role and citizens are expected to make certain sacrifices, including freedoms of expression and voting and the ability to choose or criticize governments. Are downplayed in societies like that. The trade-off is that the state takes care of you. And what Trump's doing here is that he's also sort of left the whole liberal project behind, and he's introduced a new paradigm. So the Monroe Doctrine is the Don-Roe Doctrine is an update of the Monroe, where the Monroe one was basically the states dominate in the Western Hemisphere, which includes northern Latin America. And he's in the new security strategy he just released in the Indo-Pacific region, for example, he says that belongs to China. However, our job is to make sure they don't dominate it. So we have our friends down there, particularly Korea, South Korea, for example, and we have to contain or limit China's power in that part of the world. And with Venezuela in particular, the issue is that this is part of the clash, is that Venezuela has stood up to the States and is not going to be a vassal that the Monroe Doctrine requires, that it's defied the States. And of course, that makes it a natural ally of the Chinese and the Russians, who are happy to bring into their camp, into their BRICS camp, as many countries as they can. And the BRICS has been growing steadily. It's up to nearly 30 members now. And how do you do that? Well, then what can they do that now Maduro is being kidnapped and Trump is basically proposing to take over running the country and basically confiscate its oil assets? There's not much they can do. Militarily, that's not really an option. That Russia sent some missiles to make any invasion more expensive for the Americans, but the Americans have overwhelming force. And so all they can do is complain loudly and highlight the hypocrisy of the US position. Because what Trump has just done is pretty much exactly the same as what Putin's done into Ukraine. You know, he's walked in defiance of the UN Charter, he's ignored international law because of his so-called security concerns. And Trump's doing the same thing. The big difference between them is that the Don-Roe version, is using business as a weapon, using commerce as a weapon. So the tariffs is now a political weapon. It's not a way to regulate trade or rebalance trade. It's simply a mechanism to punish countries that don't get on board with an American-led world.
Indeed, it's significant. Ben, thank you. Mark, I'm going to bring you back in here. Does these events that have transpired over the last 48 hours, does it effectively tell Latin America that you are not sovereign if Washington decides otherwise, especially if you're have the largest oil reserves in the world?
I'd just say that Ben's comments were excellent, and one of the wonderful things about this is being able to have a debate whether we agree on everything or not, and this is vital in regard to all of these spheres. So a shout out to you. The key is this, Thomas. Also, you've got to remember, Trump voted back in the second term. We'd had on the border endless mass illegal immigration that had come over that border down there. I know very well. That is what's gone on. That's been a huge concern. But whether that's 11 million or 50 million illegals that have come over, and that's something that that has been weaponized, that's been used to then come against America and what it then stands for. There is also wanting to work with Mexico, address the cartels, address all the other issues that are going on in there. My prayer is that hopefully there can be an adult conversation. It's understandable when you look at Florida, you look at many people that live there, that were in Cuba, fled Cuba, have relatives in Cuba. There is all of these issues in regard to an ideology of communism that people object to, and I get that. In Venezuela, right now, in my humble opinion, is that the American authorities, and I totally hear what Ben is saying in regard to the oil industry, and of course, previously, many companies from America had invested in Venezuela, feel that they have put a heck of a lot of money in there, and then would like that back. But here is the grown-up pressure is to actually want to see Venezuela flourish as a free democratic society. And of course, there were huge concerns over the election last year. There have been huge concerns over that they run their elections. I think even companies that run the Dominion voting machines have even questioned that, which I find a little bit of a joke. So they have questioned that. They've questioned when suddenly energy is turned off, when you're holding an election, and etc. There is a lot to lay out here. Sorry, Thomas.
That's all right. Ben, could I get your response to this? And of course, Donald Trump famously using his saying, thrusting on peace through strength when it comes to this. However, what happens is if this fails, particularly as the United States no longer has troops in Venezuela, the government remains there, the head has been chopped off the snake, but of course now the Supreme Court has indeed confirmed the vice president into power in Maduro's position. Does the US double down, withdraw, or leave a broken state behind here?
It's kind of hard to see, isn't it? I mean, the US doesn't have much of a military presence in South America at all, unlike, you know, in Europe and Japan, where it has a massive military presence either side of Russia and China. That's strategically done on purpose, and they've kind of militarily ignored South America. So how is he going to take over the country and manipulate it? How is he going to choose an appropriate government, which is what he's threatening to do? But then again, I mean, one of the big takeaways with Trump is that he's progressively undermining and destabilizing the world step by step. Putting the sanctions on the dollar on Russia has been enormously damaging because money works on the basis of trust. And suddenly Russia had 300 billion confiscated, which means you no longer trust the dollar because it could be confiscated by the states. And what he's just done here is he's effectively done the same thing. He's sort of, you know, confiscated democracy by kidnapping the president of another country. And all the other countries in the region are now looking at that. I think in Cuba and in Colombia, particularly, the presidents there are like, well, look, if I get on the wrong side of the states, they're not just going to sanction me. They're going to fly like Black Hawk helicopters into my compound and grab me or shoot me. And this is, you know, this is not how democracy works. And the whole idea of the Americans choosing and putting in a government that it likes, again, undermines democracy. It should, you know, Venezuela belongs to the Venezuelan people, and they should choose their governments. And unfortunately, a lot of these developing countries, the democratic process, the institutions are simply missing. And so it's easy to buy votes, to cheat, to fix votes, and that goes on. But it's a journey all countries have to go through. Again, in our patch in Eastern Europe, we've seen democracy develop, and it hasn't got very far in Russia, but it's went a long way in Ukraine through a couple of revolutions. And Venezuela needs to do the same thing, and you can't just impose governments. And last point I should make here is actually this is the basis of American foreign policy is since the end of the Second World War, the CIA has gone in and every 6 months interfered in some election somewhere. And in South America, it's pretty much every country they've interfered with, trying to put in, and this is the American policy, put in people that they deem to be American friendly, rather than, as my colleague was saying, just letting the country flourish and go through that very painful growing up process of doing elections and having corrupt leaders and having a revolution and throwing them out and putting in civil society. And like I say, you look at Russia and Ukraine, absolutely black and white. Ukraine has a vibrant civil society now. It still has a lot of problems and corruption, but it has real elections, and people like Zelensky are beholden to the people in the way that Putin isn't. And Venezuela, I'm afraid to say, is still, you know, a long way to go down that road.
Mark, Ben, stay with us as we have further updates. And despite larger dissent among Venezuelans, there are people who are supporting the US strikes. Dozens of Venezuelans gathered at Buenos Aires' obelisk to celebrate President Nicolas Maduro's capture following a US military intervention. Exiled citizens joined celebrations reflecting on their uncertain future. Let's listen in.
Es lo que siempre hemos esperado. Hemos esperado que Venezuela sea libre, que podamos regresar. Yo personalmente como joven quiero volver a mi país y hacer todo lo que pueda para que mi país vuelva y se levante. Mi país es hermoso, tiene mucho potencial desperdiciado por este gobierno socialista. Quisiera volver, soy venezolano, tengo mis raíces allá. Argentina nos abrigó muy bien, nos tratan muy bien, es muy agradecido, pero yo soy venezolano.
Hoy amanecimos con la esperanza, no sabíamos si era inteligencia artificial, si las imágenes eran por IA, hasta que realmente se hizo verdadero y dieron las declaraciones oficiales, pero es el paso a un nuevo camino, la posibilidad y una esperanza. Esto no se ha acabado lamentablemente, pero por lo menos hay un camino.
Y mucha esperanza porque es el primer paso de un comienzo de algo nuevo. Un país que vuelve a nacer. La verdad que yo estoy muy emocionado también por esto que está pasando.
In fact, people from different parts of the world are criticizing the operation, absolute resolve by the United States